There is a moment in Season 5, Episode 31 of Regular Show, called Dumped at the Altar, which aired on June 25th, 2015, where Mordecai stands up at Muscle Man's wedding and begins making a speech. It is not a toast. It is not a celebration of his friend's love. It is a public, rambling confession about his own romantic confusion, delivered in front of every person he knows, at an event that has nothing to do with him. The groom is standing right there. Muscle Man, who has spent seasons earning this moment through genuine emotional growth, through the Trucker Hall of Fame grief and the Starla courtship, and the slow process of becoming someone capable of committing his life to another person, is standing right there. The bride is standing right there. Starla, who has matched Muscle Man's growth step for step, who has accepted him at his worst and celebrated him at his best, is standing right there. And Mordecai, the character who spent the first 2 seasons of the show as a reasonably self-aware, mildly anxious 23-year-old trying to figure out his life, has become someone who would hijack a wedding to process his own feelings out loud. The show does not frame this as a joke. It frames it as a character moment, and that is the problem. That scene is not a glitch. It is the destination of a 5-year journey that television calls Flanderisation, and Regular Show is one of the most fascinating case studies of the phenomenon ever produced. Before we go further, a quick note. If you enjoy long-form sleep essays like this, subscribing helps the channel keep going. It is free and takes about 3 seconds. Now, back to it. The term Flanderisation comes from Ned Flanders. If you are unfamiliar with the concept, which is entirely possible because it lives primarily in the corners of the internet, where people discuss narrative theory with the intensity that other corners reserve for sports statistics, the short version is this. Ned Flanders is a character on The Simpsons. In the early seasons of that show, roughly seasons 1 through 8, Ned Flanders is a good neighbor. He is kind. He is generous. He lends things without expecting them back. He raises his children with care and consistency. He goes to church, and his faith is presented as one aspect of a fully rounded personality that also includes humor, patience, a genuine affection for Homer Simpson, despite Homer's relentless hostility, and a quiet resilience in the face of personal tragedy. Ned Flanders in the early Simpsons is not defined by his religion. He is a good person who happens to be religious, and the distinction matters. Over the course of the next 20-plus seasons, the show gradually erases the distinction. Ned's religion, which was one trait among many, is amplified season by season until it becomes the only trait. He stops being a good neighbor who goes to church and becomes a religious fanatic who happens to live next door. His kindness is reinterpreted as passive-aggressive righteousness. His patience is reinterpreted as repression. His faith, which was once presented as a source of genuine comfort and moral guidance, is turned into a joke. The punchline of a character who has been reduced to a single note played louder and louder until the note is all you can hear. This process, the gradual reduction of a complex character to a single exaggerated trait, was given the name Flanderisation by TV tropes, and was gradually reduced over the course of 30-plus seasons to a one-dimensional religious caricature. The concept was codified by TV tropes, the collaborative wiki that has spent over 2 decades cataloging narrative patterns across fiction with an obsessiveness that borders on academic. The site has entries for thousands of narrative devices, from the mundane to the obscure, and Flanderisation is among the most referenced and most debated. The concept resonated because it named something that audiences had been feeling for decades without having a word for it. You knew the experience. You had watched a character you loved slowly become a character you tolerated, and then a character you resented. And you could not explain why the change felt like a betrayal, except to say that the character was not the same person anymore. Flanderisation gave that feeling a name, and the name gave people permission to analyze it, rather than simply endure it. The wiki and it describes a specific failure mode in long-running storytelling. The failure is not laziness, though laziness can contribute. It is not incompetence, though incompetence can accelerate it. It is, at its core, a failure of attention. The writers stop paying attention to the whole character and start paying attention to the part of the character that is easiest to use, the part that generates story, the part that creates conflict, the part that makes the audience laugh or cringe or react in the way that the show has learned to depend on. A character begins with multiple traits. One trait gets laughs, or drives plots efficiently, or is simply easier to write. The writers lean on that trait. Then they lean harder. Then they lean so hard that the trait becomes the character, and everything else that made the character interesting falls away. The person becomes a puppet operated by a single string, and the audience can see the string, even if the show cannot. You know the feeling. You are watching a show you love, and a character you care about says or does something that feels wrong. Not morally wrong, but wrong in the way that a note played slightly flat is wrong. And you think, this person would not do that. This person would not say that. And you are right, the person would not. But the caricature would, because the caricature has been optimized for one function. And that function demands exactly this behavior in exactly this situation. And the show has stopped asking whether the behavior is consistent with the person and started asking only whether it is consistent with the function. That is the moment Flanderisation becomes visible, not when the trait begins to grow. Growth is natural and can be interesting, but when the growth has consumed everything else, and the character looks out at you from the screen with eyes that no longer contain the complexity you remember. What makes regular show's relationship with Flanderisation so unusual, so worth spending 2 hours talking about while you drift off to sleep, is that the show both commits the sin and corrects it. Most shows do one or the other. The Simpsons commits and never corrects. Avatar, The Last Airbender corrects course before the sin fully manifests. Family Guy commits and then leans into the commitment as a stylistic choice, daring the audience to care about character consistency in a show that has abandoned consistency as a creative principle. Regular show is messier than any of these approaches, and the messiness is what makes it interesting. The show both commits the sin and corrects it, sometimes with the same character, sometimes across different seasons, and sometimes within the span of a single episode. The show is aware of what it is doing to its characters, even when it cannot stop doing it. The awareness does not prevent the damage, but it does, eventually, motivate the repair. And the repair, when it comes, is often more interesting than the original versions of the character ever was. To understand how this works, you need to look at each character individually, not as a roster, not as a list, but as a series of case studies in how a single exaggerated trait can consume a person, and how, if the writing is brave enough, that person can be rebuilt from the wreckage of their own caricature. To understand what regular show did to its characters, and what it later did about what it did, you need to see the cast as they existed at the beginning, before the erosion set in. Regular show premiered on September 6th, 2010 on Cartoon Network, created by J.G. Quintel, who developed the concept from 2 animated shorts he produced while studying at the California Institute of the Arts. The show ran for 8 seasons and 261 episodes, concluding on January 16th, 2017, with the 33-minute finale, a regular epic final battle. In that span of time, the show introduced a cast of characters who, in the early seasons, felt like real people trapped in absurd situations. This is the key distinction. The situations were absurd. A videotape that summons a British taxi from another dimension. A hot dog man who gains supernatural powers. A magical keyboard that grants wishes through autocorrect. The premises were insane, consistently and gloriously insane. And the comedy came not from the premises themselves, but from the fact that the characters reacting to the premises were recognizable human beings. You knew a Mordecai. You knew a Rigby. You had worked for a Benson. The characters were real, and the reality was what made the absurdity funny rather than arbitrary. The show introduced a cast of characters who, in the early seasons, felt like real people trapped in absurd situations, and then, in the middle seasons, began to feel like absurd people trapped in repetitive ones. And then, in the middle seasons, began to feel like absurd people trapped in repetitive ones. The journey from the first state to the second, and in some cases back again, is the story this video tells. The first and most visible case is Mordecai, the Blue Jay, the protagonist, the character around whom the show's emotional center was supposed to orbit, and the character whose Flanderisation is, depending on who you ask, either the show's greatest failure or its most honest accident. In the pilot and across the first 2 seasons of regular show, Mordecai is a specific kind of person that you have almost certainly met. He is 23 years old. He dropped out of art school. He works a job he does not particularly care about at a park with his best friend from childhood. He is mildly anxious, the way people in their early 20s are anxious. Not clinically, not dramatically, but in the low-grade persistent way that comes from knowing you should be doing more with your life and not quite knowing what more looks like. He is somewhat self-aware, aware enough to recognize his own patterns, but not aware enough to break them, which is perhaps the most honest portrayal of young adult self-awareness that animated television has ever produced. He is occasionally lazy, but his laziness is different from Rigby. Mordecai's laziness is the laziness of someone who knows what he should be doing and chooses not to do it, while Rigby's laziness is the laziness of someone who has not yet figured out what he should be doing and would rather not find out. And he is fundamentally decent. He has a crush on a girl named Margaret who works at the coffee shop across the street, and his inability to act on that crush is played for comedy, but the comedy is grounded in something recognizable. You have been in this situation. You have stood at a counter and ordered a coffee and tried to think of something clever to say to someone you found attractive and come up with nothing, or worse, come up with something that sounded reasonable in your head and absurd the moment it left your mouth. Mordecai's romantic anxiety in the early seasons is drawn from life. It is not exaggerated for effect. It is not amplified to the point of absurdity. It is the exact right amount of anxiety for a 23-year-old who has not yet figured out what kind of person he's trying to become. And the specificity of the portrayal is what makes it funny rather than pathetic. There is a difference between laughing at a character's weakness and laughing in recognition of a shared one. An early regular show consistently achieves the latter. Mordecai is not pathologically incapable of talking to women. He is a young man who has not yet figured out who he is, and the uncertainty makes him hesitant. That hesitation is a trait. It is one of several traits. In the first 2 seasons, Mordecai is also brave in emergencies, loyal to a fault, creative when the situation demands it, and capable of genuine emotional insight when he is not overthinking things. The hesitation exists alongside these other qualities. It does not define him. It colors him. The shift begins in Season 3, which premiered on September 19th, 2011, with the episode Stick Hockey. It does not happen all at once. Flanderisation rarely does. It is not a switch that flips. It is a gradient, a slow change in the mixture of traits that define a character. And the change is so gradual that you often do not notice it until you go back to the beginning and realize that the character you are watching now is not the character you started with. It is like looking at a photograph of yourself from 10 years ago. The face is the same. The eyes are the same. Something fundamental has shifted, and you cannot point to the exact moment it shifted, because it shifted a little bit every day, and you were there every day. So you never saw the accumulation. What happens is that the writers discover something. They discover that Mordecai's romantic anxiety generates reliable plot material. An episode where Mordecai cannot talk to Margaret is an episode that writes itself. The setup is built in. The conflict is built in. The resolution, which usually involves Mordecai doing something catastrophically awkward, is built in. It is a template, and templates are efficient, and efficiency is the enemy of character complexity. By Season 4, which premiered on October 1st, 2012, the template has begun to calcify. Mordecai's romantic anxiety is no longer one color in a palette. It is becoming the palette. Episodes that should be about other things, about the park, about the supernatural chaos that makes the show distinctive, are increasingly filtered through the lens of Mordecai's love life. His relationship with Margaret intensifies. The show devotes increasing screen time to their interaction, to the will they won't they tension that drives ratings and generates social media discussion and gives the audience something to argue about between episodes. His inability to express his feelings cleanly intensifies faster than the relationship itself. This is the mathematical signature of Flanderisation. The trait grows faster than the context that contains it. Mordecai's anxiety about Margaret was once proportional to the situations he found himself in. By Season 4, the anxiety has become disproportionate. He panics in situations where a calm conversation would resolve everything. He freezes in moments where the other person has already given him every signal he needs. He overthinks when thinking is not required, and underthinks when thinking would help. The character has become a vehicle for a single emotional state, and the state is not even an interesting one. Romantic anxiety, rendered at this volume and this frequency, is not compelling. It is repetitive. It is the same song played on the same instrument at the same tempo, in the same key, episode after episode, until the audience can predict the melody before the first note sound. And the other traits that made early Mordecai interesting, his bravery, his creativity, his capacity for emotional insight, begin to recede. Not because the show has forgotten them. So, the show still deploys them occasionally, in moments of crisis, when the plot requires Mordecai to be competent. But between those moments, the default setting has changed. The default Mordecai of Season 4 is not the default Mordecai of Season 1. The default has narrowed. Season 4 ends with Stake Me Amadeus, which aired on August 12th, 2013. And the episode title alone tells you something about the show's relationship with its own romantic subplot. The title is a pun on Amadeus, the name associated with Mozart, with genius, with the intersection of passion and art. And it is applied to an episode about ordering steak at a restaurant. The deflation is intentional. The show knows that it has been building toward this moment with the intensity of a romantic epic. And the title undercuts the intensity with a reminder that this is, at its core, a show about people who work at a park. In that episode, Mordecai finally asks Margaret to be his girlfriend at a restaurant, and Margaret says yes, and then immediately reveals that she has been accepted to her dream college and is leaving. The episode is a genuine gut punch, well written, and emotionally effective. But it also reveals the trap the show has built for itself. Mordecai's entire arc for 2 seasons has been building toward this moment with Margaret, and the moment, when it arrives, is immediately taken away. The show has invested so heavily in Mordecai as romantic anxious mess that it does not know what to do with him once the source of the anxiety changes. What follows, in seasons 5 and 6, is the most controversial stretch of character writing in regular show's history. Margaret leaves for college, and for a brief window, the show breathes. Mordecai has space to exist without the gravitational pull of a romantic subplot, and the episodes in this window are some of the strongest of the later season, because they remember that Mordecai is more than his love life. But the window closes quickly. A new love interest named CJ is introduced, initially in the season 4 episode Yes, Dude, Yes, which aired on November 12th, 2012, as a blind date setup that Mordecai attends while believing Margaret is engaged. CJ is, by most accounts, a better match for Mordecai. The show establishes this quickly and convincingly. In their early episodes together, Mordecai and CJ bond over video games, over horror movies, over a shared sense of humor that Mordecai and Margaret never quite developed. The chemistry is visible. You can see, as a viewer, why these two people would choose each other. CJ pushes Mordecai in directions that Margaret did not. She calls him out when he is being evasive. She asks him direct questions and expects direct answers. She is, in the language of relationship advice columns, emotionally available in a way that Margaret, who was always slightly out of reach, never was. And this makes the subsequent Flanderisation of the relationship even more painful to watch, because the show has done the work of establishing that these two characters are good together. You believe in Mordecai and CJ. You want them to succeed. You can see the version of the story where Mordecai grows up because CJ gives him a reason to. And the show chooses, deliberately and repeatedly, to deny that version in favor of the one where Mordecai reverts to his worst self every time the plot requires tension. She is confident where Margaret was passive. She is direct where Margaret was ambiguous. She shares Mordecai's interests and challenges him in ways Margaret never did. And Mordecai, the character whose defining trait has now fully crystallized into romantic incompetence, proceeds to ruin the relationship in the most frustrating way possible. Not through malice, not through a single dramatic betrayal, through a pattern of indecision so chronic and so repetitive that it stops being sympathetic and starts being irritating. The love triangle between Mordecai, CJ, and Margaret dominates seasons 5 and 6 in a way that distorts the entire show. Episodes that should be about Rigby's growth, or Benson's management struggles, or the park's supernatural adventures are pulled into the orbit of Mordecai's inability to choose between two women. And the inability is not portrayed as a complex, emotional dilemma. It is portrayed as a recurring failure. The same failure, expressed in slightly different situations, over and over, until the audience can predict the pattern before it begins. Mordecai will be doing well with CJ. Margaret will appear. Mordecai will become paralyzed. Something will go wrong. The episode will end with the problem unresolved. This is Flanderisation in its purest form. The character has been reduced to a single mechanism, and the mechanism runs on a loop. The worst moment, the one that crystallizes the problem, is the wedding scene, dumped at the altar, the season 6 finale. Mordecai stands up at Muscle Man's wedding, the wedding of a colleague who has spent multiple seasons building a genuine, earned relationship with Starla, and makes it about himself. He talks about soulmate. He talks about confusion. He attempts to publicly process his feelings about CJ while CJ is standing there, while Margaret is standing there, while every person in the cast is standing there. The scene is agonizing, not because it is dramatic, but because it is embarrassing. And the embarrassment is not the clever, self-aware embarrassment of the early seasons. It is the embarrassment of watching a character who has been written into a corner so thoroughly that the writers have no tool left except escalation. What makes Mordecai's Flanderisation especially painful is that it did not have to happen. The character who existed in seasons 1 and 2 was rich enough to support stories that had nothing to do with romance. He was an artist who dropped out of art school. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that means for a character in a show that ran for 8 seasons. A young man who cared enough about art to pursue it as a career, who enrolled in an institution dedicated to creative development, and who left before finishing. The reasons for leaving are hinted at, but never fully explored during the Flanderized middle season. Was it financial? Was it a crisis of confidence? Was it the realization that the gap between his talent and his ambition was wider than he could bridge? Every one of those possibilities is a well of unexplored material deep enough to sustain entire seasons. Every one of them connects to something real that your viewers have experienced or feared or are currently living through. The 23-year-old art school dropout working at a park is one of the most relatable premises in animated television, and the show set it aside in favor of asking which girl Mordecai would fail to text back this week. He was a best friend, navigating the complicated dynamics of growing up at different speeds than the person he grew up with. That is a story the show told brilliantly through Rigby, but rarely allowed Mordecai to inhabit from his own perspective. He was a young man working a dead-end job and trying to figure out what kind of life he wanted. That is perhaps the most relatable premise in the entire show, and it was largely abandoned in favor of which girl Mordecai would fail to communicate with this week. The show knows this. The show eventually admits this. In Season 7, which premiered on June 26, 2015, the love triangle is resolved not with a dramatic choice, but with an exhausted surrender. Mordecai does not end up with CJ. He does not end up with Margaret. He does not end up with anyone. The show, which spent 4 seasons insisting that Mordecai's romantic life was the most important thing about him, finally, belatedly, admits that it was wrong. Mordecai sits on a bench with Rigby. The park is quiet. The supernatural chaos has subsided for the moment. And Mordecai says, essentially, that he has been handling his relationships badly. The words are simple. The admission is not dramatic. There is no swelling music, no dramatic camera angle, no indication that the show considers this moment a turning point. And yet, it is the most important moment in Mordecai's entire arc, because it is the moment where the character's self-awareness, which has been dormant since the early seasons, resurfaces. Mordecai sees himself clearly for the first time in years. He sees what he has been doing, and he sees that it is not working, and he makes the quiet, unremarkable decision to stop. The bench scene is the opposite of the wedding scene. Where the wedding was loud and public and humiliating, the bench is quiet and private and honest. Where the wedding represented the peak of Mordecai's Flanderisation, the bench represents its end. And the contrast between the two moments is the show's way of telling you that it knows the difference between spectacle and substance, even if the middle seasons sometimes forgot, and that he needs to stop making romance the center of his identity. It is not a triumphant moment. It is a tired one. And it is the first step in the de-Flanderization of Mordecai, the slow process by which the show begins to restore the other colors to his palette. The final 2 seasons of regular show treat Mordecai with a care that the middle seasons did not. The writing slows down. The episodes stop relying on the same emotional mechanism. Mordecai is allowed to be present in scenes without the conversation circling back to his romantic failures. He is allowed to be funny in ways that are not connected to his anxiety. He is allowed to be competent, not just in crisis situations, but in ordinary ones. In moments where the competence does not come from adrenaline, but from the quiet accumulation of experience that the show calls growing up. The de-Flanderisation of Mordecai is not dramatic. There is no single episode where the writers declare that the old Mordecai is back. It happens the same way the Flanderisation happened, gradually, almost invisibly, through a series of small choices that, over time, restore the character's range. Season 8, subtitled Regular Show in Space, which premiered on September 26, 2016, removes the romantic subplot entirely by sending the entire park into orbit. Mordecai's arc in the final season is about friendship, about sacrifice, about rising to an occasion that is bigger than his personal anxiety. And in the finale montage, in the final minutes of the final episode of the entire series, the show reveals that Mordecai eventually becomes an artist. He paints. The camera shows his work hanging in a gallery, and the work is good, and the moment is quiet. And the quietness is devastating because it reminds you of everything the show chose not to explore during the years it was exploring his love life instead. This is who Mordecai was. This is what the character wanted. Underneath the romantic anxiety, underneath the Flanderisation, underneath the 5 seasons of Which Girl Should I Choose? He wanted to make art. He wanted to sit in a room with a canvas and a brush and turn the things inside his head into things that other people could see and feel and carry with them. He wanted to create something that outlasted him, something that existed independently of his romantic failures and his workplace frustrations and the supernatural disasters that consumed so many of his best years. And the show waited until its final minutes to give him that, as if acknowledging that the delay was the cost of the Flanderisation, the time that was lost to the wrong story. He finds a partner who is never named and never given a character arc because the show has finally understood that Mordecai's love life was never the interesting part of Mordecai. The interesting part was always the person underneath the anxiety, the person the show spent 3 seasons burying and 2 seasons excavating. The tragedy of Mordecai's Flanderisation is not that it happened. Long-running shows Flandery's characters the way rivers erode banks, slowly, persistently, through the constant pressure of needing to produce stories on a schedule that does not care about character integrity. Slowly, invisibly, inevitably. The tragedy is that the show was good enough to notice what it had done and honest enough to try to fix it, but the fix came too late to undo the damage to the audience's relationship with the character. Mordecai is, for many viewers, permanently associated with the love triangle. The early Mordecai, the one who was brave and creative and capable of insight, has been overwritten in the collective memory by the Mordecai who could not choose between 2 women across 40 episodes. That is what Flanderisation does. It does not just change the character. It changes the audience's memory of who the character used to be. If Mordecai's Flanderisation is a cautionary tale about what happens when writers find a template, Rigby's is a story about what happens when they find a target. Rigby, the raccoon, Mordecai's best friend, the shorter and louder half of the show's central partnership, undergoes a Flanderisation arc that is in some ways more severe than Mordecai's, and in other ways more instructive, because Rigby's arc eventually reverses so completely that the character who exists at the end of the show is almost unrecognizable from the character who existed in the middle. In the first 2 seasons, Rigby is lazy. This is not in dispute. It is the first thing you learn about him and the last thing you forget. But laziness, in the hands of good writers, is not a single trait. It is a constellation of behaviors that can be explored from multiple angles, and the early seasons explore it well. He does not want to work. He would rather play video games than rake leaves. He cuts corners. He complains. He is the id to Mordecai's ego, the character who says out loud what everyone is thinking, but no one wants to admit. And in those early seasons, The laziness is part of a larger picture. Rigby is also clever in a chaotic, improvisational way. He is loyal, even when his loyalty creates problems. He is sensitive beneath the bravado, easily hurt by rejection, and desperately seeking validation from people whose approval he pretends not to need. The laziness is the most visible trait, but it is not the only trait. It is the surface of a character who has depth. Season 3, which premiered on September 19th, 2011, begins the narrowing. The writers discover that Rigby's laziness and selfishness are reliable comedy generators. An episode where Rigby does something irresponsible and faces consequences is a proven structure. So they lean in. Rigby becomes lazier. His selfishness intensifies. His willingness to endanger others for trivial personal gains, which in the early seasons was played as a mild character flaw, is amplified until it becomes genuinely destructive. The evidence is spread across dozens of episodes. In Season 3's Excellent, which aired on May 28, 2012, Rigby eats a dangerous omelet on a dare despite being warned repeatedly that it could kill him, landing himself in a coma and forcing Mordecai to risk his own life in a cooking challenge to save him. The selfishness of the act, putting your best friend in jeopardy because you could not resist a meaningless dare, is staggering when you think about it outside the frame of comedy. In Season 4's The Longest Weekend, Rigby's inability to leave Mordecai alone for a single weekend, to respect his friend's relationship enough to give him space, drives an entire episode of escalating boundary violation. In Season 5's Wall Buddy, the dynamic continues. Rigby lies. Rigby deflects blame. Rigby creates consequences that other people must absorb. The pattern across these episodes is consistent. The Flanderized Rigby does not learn. Each episode resets him to the same default. The consequences he faces at the end of one episode do not carry over into the next. He apologizes, the friendship repairs, and the cycle begins again. This is the structural signature of Flanderisation. The character is trapped in a loop, performing the same essential action in different costumes, and the loop prevents genuine development because genuine development requires permanent change, and permanent change would break the loop that the show depends on for stories, and then, in the final act, is either forgiven without consequence or faces a consequence so temporary that it has no lasting impact on his behavior. The Flanderization of Rigby is the Flanderization of selfishness. In Season 1, Rigby is selfish the way most 23-year-olds are selfish, casually, without malice, as a default setting that he has not yet learned to override. By Season 4, Rigby is selfish the way cartoon villains are selfish, deliberately, repeatedly, and in defiance of all evidence that his selfishness hurts people he claims to care about. The character has been compressed into a single function. He exists to create problem. He is the show's chaos engine, and the engine has been stripped of everything that is not combustion. The most discussed example of Rigby's mid-series Flanderization is his treatment of Mordecai. In the early seasons, the friendship between them is the emotional bedrock of the show. They argue, they compete, they occasionally hurt each other's feelings, but the underlying affection is always visible, always present, always the thing that resolves the conflict when the supernatural chaos subsides. By Season 4, the dynamic has shifted. Rigby's provocations are meaner. His disregard for Mordecai's feelings is more callous. The friendship begins to feel less like a partnership between equals and more like a parasitic relationship in which one party takes and the other tolerates. Mordecai puts up with Rigby, not because Rigby enriches his life, but because the show requires them to be in the same room. The regular show movie, which aired on November 25th, 2015, provides the most concentrated example of Rigby's Flanderized worth. The film reveals that Rigby, years earlier, sabotaged Mordecai's college acceptance letter, directly causing Mordecai to fail to get into the university that would have changed his life. The betrayal is not small. It is, in fact, the largest single betrayal in the entire show, larger than any supernatural threat, larger than any cosmic villain, because it is personal and deliberate and directed at the person Rigby claims to love most in the world. It is the kind of betrayal that, in a realistic narrative, would end a friendship permanently. Not because the act itself is unforgivable, though reasonable people could argue that it is, but because the act reveals something about the person who committed it that cannot be unknown. Once you know that your best friend sabotaged your future to keep you close, you know something about your best friend that changes the shape of every previous memory. Every favor becomes suspicious. Every moment of loyalty becomes potentially self-serving. The knowledge retroactively poisons the relationship, not because the poisoner intended harm, but because knowledge, once acquired, cannot be selectively applied. And the show asks you to forgive it. The movie asks you to understand that Rigby was afraid of losing his friend, that the sabotage came from a place of insecurity rather than malice, and that understanding should be sufficient for reconciliation. For some viewers, it is. For others, it is the moment where Rigby's Flanderisation crosses a line from which the character cannot return. But the character does return, and this is where Rigby's arc becomes genuinely interesting, because the de-Flanderisation of Rigby is one of the best character rehabilitation projects in animated television. It begins in Season 6 and accelerates in Season 7, and it is driven by a single narrative choice that changes everything. Rigby goes back to school. The decision to send Rigby back to high school, to have him complete the education he abandoned years earlier, is a masterstroke of character writing because it addresses the root cause of his Flanderisation, rather than merely suppressing the symptom. Most shows that attempt to de-Flanderize a character do it through a single dramatic event, a near-death experience that changes priority, a betrayal that forces self-reflection, a speech from another character that functions as a wake-up call. These approaches can work, but they are cosmetic. They change the character's behavior without changing the underlying structure that produced the behavior. The character acts differently, but is not fundamentally different. Regular show avoids this trap by choosing a de-Flanderization method that is slow, unglamorous, and built on effort rather than epiphany. Rigby was not lazy because he was a bad person. He was lazy because he was afraid. And the fear is specific. It is not a vague, generalized anxiety about the future or about failure in the abstract. It is the fear of being found out. The fear that if he tries, really tries, at anything, the result will confirm what he has always suspected about himself, that he is not good enough, not smart enough, not talented enough, not capable of the things that seem to come easily to the people around him. To Mordecai, who got into art school, to Eileen, who is effortlessly intelligent, to Skips, who knows everything, to Benson, who at least has the competence to manage a workplace, even if the workplace is staffed by lunatics. Rigby's laziness is a preemptive defense against this confirmation. If you never try, you never fail. If you never fail, you never have to confront the possibility that your limitations are real rather than theoretical. The strategy is irrational, of course. Everyone around Rigby can see that the laziness is creating exactly the outcomes he is trying to avoid. By refusing to develop any skills, he ensures that he remains the least capable person in the room, which confirms the inadequacy he was trying to hide, which makes the laziness feel even more necessary. The cycle is vicious, self-reinforcing, and utterly human. The show, during the Flanderized middle seasons, ignores this psychology entirely. The Flanderized Rigby is lazy because laziness is funny. The depth is gone. The fear is gone. What remains is a cartoon raccoon who does not want to work and creates problems for people who do. And the simplification is a loss, not just for the character, but for the audience, because the audience recognized themselves in the fear, and the show took the recognition away and replaced it with a punchline. Afraid of failure, afraid of being exposed as less capable than the people around him, afraid that effort would reveal limitations he would rather not confront. The laziness was a defense mechanism, and the show had spent 4 seasons treating the defense mechanism as the whole character. By sending him back to school, the show peels back the mechanism and shows you what is underneath. Rigby's return to education is not played for comedy, or at least not primarily. There are funny moments. There are episodes where the absurdity of a 25-year-old raccoon sitting in a high school classroom generates the kind of situational comedy that regular show does better than almost any show on television. But the comedy is built on a foundation of sincerity, and the sincerity is what carries the arc. The show respects Rigby's decision to go back. It does not treat it as a joke, or a novelty, or a temporary plot device that will be abandoned when a more entertaining story presents itself. It treats it as the defining choice of Rigby's life, the moment where the character decides who he is going to be, and the respect is evident in every scene. Rigby's return to education is not played for comedy, or at least not primarily. It is played as a genuine struggle. He is older than his classmate. He is embarrassed. The work is hard, and he is out of practice, and the temptation to quit is enormous. But he does not quit. And the Rigby who emerges from this process, the Rigby of seasons 7 and 8, is a fundamentally different character from the one who dominated seasons 3 through 5. He is still funny. He is still impulsive. He still says things he should not say and does things he should not do. But there is a foundation beneath the chaos now, a sense that this person has confronted something about himself and chosen to be different. He proposes to Eileen. The proposal is not a grand gesture. It is not a public spectacle designed to generate maximum narrative impact. It is a private moment between two people who have grown toward each other slowly, across seasons, through the accumulation of shared experiences and mutual understanding. Rigby does not propose because the plot requires a dramatic event. He proposes because he has become a person capable of commitment, and the becoming happened in the background, in the school hallways, in the study sessions, and the quiet evenings where two people who used to be strangers learned each other's rhythm. He becomes a devoted partner. And the devotion is not the forced devotion of a character who has been instructed by the narrative to change. It is the natural devotion of a person who has done the internal work that makes devotion possible. Rigby can commit to Eileen because he has committed to himself first, to the version of himself that finishes things and shows up and does not run when the work gets difficult. The school arc was not about education. It was about learning to stay. He grows up. This is the simple way to say it. And the simplicity is appropriate because the growth itself is simple. Rigby grows up in the way that the show always implied he could, but never, in the Flanderized middle years, allowed him to. He stops being the chaos agent. He stops being the liability. He becomes the person that the people who loved him always believed he could become. And the becoming is the show's most satisfying character payoff because it was the hardest one to earn. The final montage of the series, which aired on January 16th, 2017, shows Rigby with a family, children, a home, a life built on the foundation that the deflanderization constructed. He and Eileen, who began as a quiet girl with a crush and a loud boy who did not notice, have become partners in the fullest sense. They have built something together, and the something is ordinary, and the ordinariness is the point. The responsibility that the early version of the character would have found suffocating, and the mid-series version would have actively fled. And the image works. It does not feel imposed. It feels earned because the show put in the narrative labor of deflanderization, of rebuilding the character from the inside out, before asking the audience to accept the transformation. Rigby's Flanderization was severe, possibly the most severe in the cast, but his recovery was equally dramatic. And the story of his recovery is ultimately more memorable than the story of his decline. Benson's Flanderization follows a different trajectory than Mordecai's or Rigby's, because Benson's defining trait, the one the show chose to amplify, was not a personal flaw, but a professional one. Benson is the park manager. He is a sentient gumball machine, and he is angry. That is the version of Benson that most viewers remember. The screaming boss whose face turns red, whose gumballs rattle inside his transparent head, whose catchphrase, "You are fired," echoes through the park like a car alarm that no one knows how to disable. But the Benson of the early seasons is considerably more than his anger. And the journey from that Benson to the screaming caricature of the middle seasons is one of the clearest illustrations of how Flanderization works in practice. In season 1, which premiered on September 6th, 2010, Benson is frustrated. This is important. Frustrated is not the same as angry. Frustration is a response to a specific situation. Anger is a personality trait. Early Benson is frustrated because he manages 2 employees who do not do their jobs, and his frustration is proportional to the provocation. When Mordecai and Rigby slack off, Benson raises his voice. When they destroy park property through supernatural negligence, Benson yells. When they put him in genuine professional jeopardy, Benson threatens to fire them. The escalation is logical. The emotion is justified. You understand Benson because you have had a boss like Benson, or you have been Benson, And either way, the character makes sense as a person. The show also gives early Benson a life outside his frustration. This is crucial because it establishes that Benson exists as a person when he is not at work, that his identity is not exhausted by his role as park manager, that there are parts of him that the job never touches. The best character writing creates people who have off-screen lives you can imagine without being shown, people who feel like they continue to exist when the camera is not pointed at them. In Season 2, the episode Benson Be Gone, which aired on March 7th, 2011, reveals that Benson cares about his job not because he is a control freak, but because the park is the only thing in his life that he has managed to hold together. There are hints of a failed drumming career. The Season 2 episode, Benson Be Gone, shows Benson playing drums alone in his apartment, and the image is one of the most quietly devastating in the show's first 2 seasons. The drumming is not bad. Benson is actually talented. He has skill and rhythm and the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of practice. And yet he is playing alone, in an empty room, for an audience of 0. The show never explains in detail what happened to the drumming career. It does not need to. The empty room explains everything. Something was tried. Something did not work. And the person who tried it ended up managing a park, channeling the energy that once went into creative expression into the less glamorous work of making sure the grass gets mowed. And this is something the show understood about Benson in the early seasons that the Flanderized middle seasons forgot entirely. Benson's anger is displaced passion. He cares too much. Not about the park. Not really. Not in the way that a bureaucrat cares about compliance. He cares about things mattering. He cares about effort being respected. He cares in the way that failed artists often care, about the gap between what things could be and what things are. And the anger is the sound of that gap refusing to close. The early Benson is a portrait of misdirected creative energy, channeling the energy that once went into art into the less glamorous work of making sure the grass gets mowed and the trash gets collected, and the 2 employees who share a bedroom do not accidentally destroy the fabric of space-time again. There are suggestions of loneliness, deep, structural loneliness, the kind that does not announce itself through dramatic gestures, but that lives in the small details of a life observed closely. Benson goes home to an empty apartment. Benson eats alone. Benson's social life, such as it is, consists almost entirely of interactions with his employees, people who are subordinate to him and therefore cannot be genuine friends, not fully, not in the way that friendship requires mutual vulnerability and the absence of power dynamic. There is a scene where Benson sits alone in his apartment and the silence around him is more eloquent than any line of dialogue. The show is telling you that this character has depth, that the frustration you see at work is the surface expression of a much larger sadness, and that the sadness is interesting. By Season 3, the show has stopped being interested in the sadness. What the show has discovered is that Angry Benson is funny. Angry Benson generates clips that get shared online. Angry Benson provides a reliable source of conflict in episodes that might otherwise lack a clear antagonist, and so the anger gets turned up, gradually at first, then rapidly. Benson's frustration, which was once proportional to the provocation, becomes disproportionate. He yells at Mordecai and Rigby for minor infractions. He threatens to fire them for things that any reasonable manager would address with a conversation. His face turns red at provocations that the Season 1 version of the character would have handled with a sigh and a headshake. The Flanderization of Benson is the Flanderization of authority. The show takes a character who represented reasonable, if imperfect, authority, a boss who was strict but fair, who cared about his employees even when they drove him to the edge of his patience, and turns him into a tyrant. The transition happens because tyranny is easier to write than nuance. An episode where Benson screams and overreacts creates immediate, reliable conflict. An episode where Benson responds proportionally to a situation requires the writers to think about what a proportional response looks like. And proportional responses are quieter, subtler, and harder to build. 22 minutes of comedy around. The worst of Benson's Flanderization occurs in the stretch from Season 3 through Season 6. Episodes in this stretch reveal a Benson who has been stripped of the humanity that made his early anger sympathetic. The Best Burger in the World, which aired on October 24th, 2011, in Season 3, depicts a Benson who is petty, vindictive, and cruel in a way that the Season 1 version of the character would not have recognized. The episode centers on Mordecai and Rigby trying to eat a legendary hamburger, and Benson, who discovers their plan, actively sabotages it. Not because their plan interferes with work, not because their plan endangers the park, but because he can. Because denying them pleasure has become its own reward for a character whose frustration has curdled into spite. The Benson of this episode does not want his employees to do their jobs. He wants them to suffer. And the distinction between those two desires is the distance Flanderisation has carried him from his starting point. Similarly, in Season 3's Temp Check, Benson replaces Rigby with a temporary worker, and the episode reveals a manager who views his employees as interchangeable parts rather than people. The replacement is not a management decision weighed against alternative. It is an impulse, acted on immediately and without reflection. And it reflects a Benson who has been reduced to the single dimension of authority wielded without empathy. The gumball machine is empty of everything except the desire to control. The early Benson, who sat alone with his drumsticks, has been written out of the character and willing to deny his employees a simple pleasure, a hamburger, for reasons that have nothing to do with workplace management and everything to do with the show needing Benson to be an obstacle. In Temp Check, Benson replaces Rigby with a temporary worker, and the episode treats the replacement as a power move rather than a management decision. The character who once sat alone in his apartment with a drumstick in his hand and sadness on his face has been reduced to a function. He is the thing that prevents fun. He is the no in a show built on yes. But Benson, like Rigby, gets a redemption arc. And Benson's redemption is quieter and in some ways more effective than Rigby's, because it does not rely on a single dramatic event. There is no moment where Benson goes back to school or confronts a deep-seated fear. Instead, the show simply begins to remember who Benson was before the Flanderisation set in. Starting in Season 6 and continuing through Seasons 7 and 8, the writing gradually restores Benson's emotional range. The process is almost imperceptible at first. An episode where Benson responds to a crisis with concern rather than rage. An episode where he laughs at something Mordecai says instead of interpreting it as insubordination. An episode where he sits in his office and the camera holds on his face and you realize, maybe for the first time in seasons, that this character is thinking rather than reacting. The restoration happens through accumulation rather than revelation, the same way the Flanderisation happened, and the symmetry is appropriate. He is allowed to be kind. He is allowed to be vulnerable. He is allowed to have relationships that are not defined by his authority over his employees. The episode, The Thanksgiving Special, in Season 7, explores Benson's family dynamics and reveals a man who has been carrying the weight of inadequacy for years, not just at work, but in his personal life, his relationship with his mother, his sense of never being good enough, his tendency to overcompensate through control. All of it is laid out with a specificity that the Flanderized episodes never bothered with. The angry gumball machine turns out to be a lonely man who uses anger the way some people use alcohol, as a way to avoid sitting with feelings that are too large and too painful to process sober. The final season treats Benson with genuine affection. In the Season 8 arc, when the park is launched into space on September 26, 2016, Benson's authority becomes irrelevant in the most literal way possible. You cannot manage a park that is orbiting Jupiter. You cannot enforce work schedules in a spaceship. You cannot threaten to fire someone when the concept of employment has been rendered meaningless by the fact that you are all going to die in a cosmic war between the embodiments of good and evil. The removal of context is the key to Benson's deflanderization. His anger was always a response to a specific environment: the park, the employees, the expectation of productivity. Remove the environment and the anger has nothing to attach to. What is left is the person underneath, and the person underneath is someone the audience has not seen clearly since Season 2. He cannot manage his way out of an intergalactic conflict. He cannot fire an alien. And stripped of the authority that the show had spent seasons reducing him to, Benson becomes a person again. He becomes the man who plays drums and cares about his friends, and rises to occasions that his Flanderized self would have met with screaming and threats. The series finale shows Benson in later life, having found love, having found peace, having become the person he always could have been if the middle seasons had not been so committed to making him a punchline. Benson's Flanderisation matters because it illustrates something important about how audiences relate to authority figures in comedy, something that extends well beyond regular show and into the fundamental mechanics of how we tell stories about power. There is a version of the authority figure archetype that comedy has used since the medium was invented. The authority figure is the obstacle. The authority figure says no. The authority figure stands between the characters the audience identifies with and the things those characters want. And the audience, who identifies with the characters who want things rather than the character who denies them, automatically aligns against the authority figure. This alignment is so automatic, so deeply embedded in how we process stories, that it takes conscious effort to override it. You side with Mordecai and Rigby, not because they are right, but because they are the protagonists, and the protagonist is the person whose desires the audience shares by default. This means that any authority figure in a comedy starts with a structural disadvantage. The audience is predisposed to view them as the obstacle rather than the person, and Flanderisation exploits this disadvantage ruthlessly. If the audience already sees Benson as the person who says no, then making Benson say no louder and more often, and with less justification, is the path of least resistance. The audience's existing alignment means they will accept an increasingly unreasonable Benson without questioning the show's portrayal, because the portrayal confirms what they already feel. The Flanderisation feeds the bias, and the bias protects the Flanderisation from scrutiny. The angry boss is one of the oldest archetypes in the genre. From Lucy Ricardo's husband to Michael Scott to Mr. Burns, comedy has always relied on authority figures who are ridiculous in their exercise of power. But the best versions of the archetype maintain a humanity beneath the absurdity. Michael Scott is a terrible boss, but he is also a desperately lonely man who wants to be loved. Mr. Burns is a monster, but he is also a relic of a vanished world that the show occasionally allows you to pity. Early Benson had this humanity. Middle Benson lost it. Late Benson recovered it. The arc is a testament to the show's willingness to admit its mistakes and do the work of correction, even when the Flanderized version was, by every measurable metric, the more popular one. Muscleman's Flanderization is the funniest one to talk about, partly because Muscleman himself is the show's primary comedian, and partly because his Flanderization is so obvious, so visible, so audible that it practically announces itself every time he opens his mouth. You know who else got Flanderized? That sentence, or some variation of it, is the mechanism of Muscleman's Flanderization, compressed into a single recurring bit that defines him more completely than any other trait he possesses. Muscleman, whose real name is Mitch Sorenstein, first appears in the show's pilot and is present throughout all 8 seasons and 261 episodes. In the earliest episodes, Muscleman is an obnoxious coworker. That is his function. He is loud. He is crude. He makes jokes that nobody finds funny except his best friend High Five Ghost. He is the person at the workplace who you tolerate, not because you enjoy his company, but because he is part of the ecosystem, and removing him would create more problems than it would solve. And in those early episodes, the My Mom jokes are one tool in a larger toolkit of obnoxiousness. Muscleman is gross. Muscleman is confrontational. Muscleman is insecure beneath the bravado. Muscleman has a complicated relationship with his father, revealed in the Season 3 episode Trucker Hall of Fame, which aired on April 2nd, 2012, where his father's death is handled with a sincerity that catches you off guard if you have only ever seen the character as a punchline. The Flanderization of Muscleman is the Flanderization of a catchphrase, the My Mom jokes, which began as one element of a deliberately abrasive personality, gradually become the personality. The show discovers that the joke works. It works as a running gag. It works as a meme. It works as a thing that audiences quote to each other, and that generates engagement online. And so the show leans in. The frequency of the jokes increases across seasons 2 through 4. In the Season 2 episode, My Mom, which aired on January 17th, 2011, the show devotes an entire episode to the joke, exploring what happens when Muscleman is challenged to stop making the jokes entirely. The episode is self-aware in a way that is both clever and telling. The show knows the joke is becoming a problem. It knows the audience notices, and it turns that awareness into a story, an episode-length acknowledgement that Muscle Man's defining bit has become compulsive, something he does not fully control, something that lives closer to addiction than to humor. But the awareness does not stop the escalation. The situations in which the jokes are deployed expand. Muscle Man makes the joke in serious moments. He makes it during crises. He makes it when other characters are in emotional pain. And the tonal dissonance between the pain and the punchline is not always played for comedy. Sometimes it is played for discomfort. And the discomfort is itself a kind of characterization, a way of showing you that this person has developed a reflex so strong that it overrides his ability to read a room. Muscle Man begins making my mom jokes in contexts where the joke does not fit, where the situation calls for a different kind of response, where the character would need to access a part of his personality that the Flanderisation has sealed off. But here's the thing about Muscle Man's Flanderisation that distinguishes it from every other case in the show, and arguably from most cases in the history of animated comedy. The show Flanderizes his surface while simultaneously developing his depth. It turns his catchphrase into a meme and his persona into a caricature, while also giving him the most emotionally honest romantic arc in the cast, the most genuinely moving death episode, and some of the most quietly devastating moments of vulnerability in the entire 8-season run. The two processes happen in parallel. They occupy the same episode. Sometimes they occupy the same scene. Muscle Man makes a my mom joke, and then, in the same conversation, says something so raw and unguarded that you forget, for a moment, that this is the same character. This should not work. It is a contradiction. You cannot reduce a character to a catchphrase and also give that character one of the most emotionally complete romantic arcs in the entire show. It violates the fundamental assumption of Flanderization, which is that the exaggeration of one trait comes at the expense of all others. And yet, regular show does it, and it works. And the reason it works is that the show treats the Flanderization itself as a character trait, rather than a writing failure. The my mom jokes are not evidence that the writers have lost control of Muscle Man. They are evidence that Muscle Man has lost control of himself. This should not work. It is a contradiction. You cannot reduce a character to a catchphrase and also give that character one of the most emotionally complete romantic arcs in the entire show. But regular show does it, and it works. And the reason it works is that the show treats the Flanderization itself as a character trait, rather than a writing failure. Muscle Man makes my mom jokes because Muscle Man is afraid of vulnerability. This is not stated explicitly in the show. It is not delivered as a revelation in a very special episode. It is communicated through the pattern of when the jokes appear and, more importantly, when they do not. Pay attention to the moments in regular show where Muscle Man drops the act. They are rare, and they are always connected to situations where the emotional stakes are too high for the armor to hold. The jokes are armor. They are the thing he puts between himself and emotional exposure. When a situation gets serious, when feelings get real, when the conversation requires him to be present and open and honest, Muscle Man reaches for the joke the way some people reach for their phone. It is a deflection mechanism, and the show, across its run, slowly peels back the deflection to reveal the person underneath. The vehicle for this revelation is Starla, Muscle Man's girlfriend, and eventually his wife, is the character who makes Muscle Man's Flanderization bearable and ultimately meaningful. Their relationship begins in season 1 and develops across the full run of the show with a consistency that no other romantic arc in regular show can match. The show takes Muscle Man and Starla seriously. This is an underrated achievement because the characters, taken at face value, are easy to dismiss. They are loud. They are crude. They are physically unattractive in the exaggerated way that animated comedy uses to signal that a character is a joke rather than a person. And yet the show refuses to treat their love as a joke. It treats it as the realest, most grounded relationship in the entire cast. More stable than Mordecai and Margaret. More honest than Mordecai and CJ. More visible than the slow burn between Rigby and Eileen. The emotional peak of the arc comes in the season 5 episode Last Meal, which aired on June 26th, 2014, where Muscle Man believes he is going to die and spends his final hours with Starla. The episode strips away every layer of the character's Flanderization. There are no my mom jokes. there is no bravado. There is no armor of any kind. There is just a man, a green man, with a body that the show has spent seasons using as a visual punchline, sitting with a woman he loves and trying to fit an entire relationship into the time he has left. The simplicity of the scene is what gives it its power. There is no supernatural intervention. There is no last-minute rescue. There is just a man who loves a woman and does not want to leave her. And the simplicity of the emotion cuts through every comedic persona the character has ever worn. The relationship culminates in the season 6 finale, Dumped at the Altar on June 25th, 2015, where they get married at the same wedding that Mordecai hijacks, is built on a foundation of mutual acceptance that the show takes seriously, even when it is also being funny. Starla knows Muscle Man is loud. She knows he is crude. She knows he makes the same joke over and over in situations where a more emotionally articulate person would say something real. And she loves him anyway. Not despite the armor, but because she can see the person behind it. The Trucker Hall of Fame episode, Season 3, Episode 20, is the inflection point. It aired on April 2nd, 2012, and it is the episode that proves Muscle Man is a real person inside the joke. Muscle Man's father, Muscle Dad, died. The show does not build up to this. It does not foreshadow it across multiple episodes or use it as the climax of a season-long arc. The death arrives with the bluntness that death actually possesses in real life, without narrative preparation, without the courtesy of advance notice. The episode deals with this directly, and in the moments of genuine grief, the my mom jokes disappear. Not because the show has forgotten them, but because Muscle Man, the character, cannot reach for the armor when the grief is too heavy for the armor to hold. What is left, when the jokes are gone, is a son who loved his father and does not know how to exist in a world where his father no longer exists. The episode earned Muscle Man an emotional credibility that the my mom jokes, no matter how frequent or how grating, could never fully erase. The Flanderisation of his surface never reached his core because the show was careful, in the episodes that mattered, to protect the core from the joke. High Five Ghost is the inverse case. He is the character who should have been Flanderized, but was instead reduced, and the reduction is its own kind of storytelling failure. Quieter than Flanderization, but equally damaging. High Five Ghost is Muscle Man's best friend. He is a small white ghost with a hand extending from the top of his head. He is present in almost every episode of the show, and for the first 3 seasons, he barely speaks. The silence is not a creative choice in the way that, say, a stoic character's silence might be. It is an absent. The show does not know what to do with High Five Ghost. He does not have a catchphrase to Flanderize. He does not have a romantic subplot to complicate. He does not have a backstory to explore, at least not in the early season. He is the character who stands next to Muscle Man and occasionally high-fives him, and the show seems to believe that this is sufficient characterization. What happens to High Five Ghost across the run of the show is not Flanderization. It is the opposite, and naming the opposite is itself instructive, because television criticism has a word for the process of reducing a character to one trait, but no widely accepted word for the process of never giving a character enough traits to reduce. You could call it stagnation. You could call it neglect. You could call it the quiet failure that happens when a cast has one too many members and the writing staff does not have enough story to go around. It is the failure to develop a character to the point where Flanderization would even be possible. You cannot exaggerate a trait that does not exist. You cannot reduce a person to a single characteristic if the person was never given more than one characteristic to begin with. High Five Ghost is the emptiest vessel in the regular show cast, and his emptiness is a reminder that Flanderization is not the only way a show can fail its characters. Sometimes the failure is not doing too much with a character, but doing too little. The show eventually addresses this, partially. In seasons 4 through 8, High Five Ghost is given more dialogue, more independent episodes, and the beginnings of an interior life. His relationship with his brother is explored in Season 4's The Christmas Special, which aired on December 3rd, 2012. He is revealed to be the most logical and level-headed member of the park crew, a designation that sneaks up on you across seasons because it is never stated explicitly, but is demonstrated through dozens of small moments where High Five Ghost is the only person in the room who sees the situation clearly. While Mordecai is overthinking, while Rigby is panicking, while Benson is raging. While Muscle Man is deflecting with humor, High Five Ghost is quietly assessing. He is the character who says the obvious thing that nobody else can see, because they are too busy performing their own traits. And the quietness of his observation, the way it arrives without fanfare or emphasis, is both his greatest strength as a character and the reason the show never figured out what to do with him. Observation is not a story engine. Clarity does not generate conflict. High Five Ghost is right too often and too quietly to build episodes around, and the rightness is his ceiling. But the development comes late and never reaches the depth that the other characters achieve. High Five Ghost remains, at the end of the show, the character who is adjacent to development without ever fully arriving at it. He is the Ghost in more ways than one, present but not quite substantial enough to cast a shadow. Pops Maillard presents perhaps the most unusual relationship with Flanderisation in the entire cast, because Pops is the character who is Flanderized in the opposite direction. The technical term for this, if you want to impress someone at a party that you should not be attending, is reverse Flanderization, or deflanderization, and it describes the process by which a character who begins as a simple caricature is gradually invested with complexity until the caricature becomes a person. Pops starts the show as a joke. He ends the show as its most important character, and the journey between those 2 points is the most dramatic character transformation regular show ever attempted. In the first 6 seasons, spanning from September 2010 to June 2015, Pops is the naive billionaire. He occupies a specific space in the ensemble that every comedy needs filled. The character who is too innocent to understand the world around him and too gentle to be harmed by the misunderstanding. His function is tonal. He exists to lower the temperature of scenes that would otherwise run too hot, to provide moments of sweetness in a show that trades primarily in chaos and absurdity. And for 6 seasons, that function is his ceiling. He has a lollipop-shaped head. He giggles at things that adults do not find funny. He does not understand technology. He does not understand sarcasm. He does not understand most of the situations unfolding around him, and his lack of understanding is played for gentle comedy. He says good show in response to things that are not good and things that are not shows. He says it when someone trips. He says it when an experiment explodes. He says it when the world is ending and everyone around him is screaming, and the only appropriate response is terror, not applause. The catchphrase is endearing and ridiculous in equal measure, and the show uses it the way it uses all of its recurring bits, as a piece of character furniture that fills the space without requiring the audience to think about what it means. He wanders through the park house like a visitor from a gentler century who accidentally got trapped in the 21st. He is sweet. He is harmless. He is, for all practical purposes, a single trait character whose trait is innocent. If the show had ended at season 6, Pops would have been a textbook example of a static Flanderized character, not one who is Flanderized through development, but one who is Flanderized from the start, created as a caricature, and left there. The naive character, the innocent, the comic relief who lightens the mood without contributing to the plot. Every animated ensemble has one. SpongeBob has Patrick. Adventure Time has LSP. The Simpsons has Ralph Wiggum. These characters serve a function, and the function is valuable, but the function is limited, and the limitation is the character's ceiling. Season 7 begins to raise the ceiling, slowly. The show drops hints that Pops is more than he appears. His strength is unusual. His emotional perceptiveness, which the early seasons played as naivety, is reframed as a different kind of intelligence. And then Season 8 arrives, and the ceiling is not raised. It is demolished. The reveal that Pops is Megacranus, the embodiment of pure good, the cosmic counterpart to his twin brother Antipops, who represents pure evil, the being whose cycle of death and rebirth has been driving the engine of the universe for 14 billion years, is the single most dramatic character revelation in the show's history. And it works because the Flanderization of the early seasons, the reduction of Pops to a single innocent trait, was actually the setup for the reveal. The innocence was not a limitation. It was a disguise, or a cocoon, or a period of dormancy before emergence. The Pops who said, "good show," and giggled at butterflies was not the lesser version of the character. He was the version that had not yet remembered what he was. This is reverse Flanderization at its most ambitious. And it works for a reason that is worth understanding. because it illuminates something fundamental about how audiences relate to characters over time. When a character is Flanderized in the traditional direction, complexity to simplicity, the audience feels betrayed. They feel that something has been taken from them. The character they knew, the character they invested in, has been replaced by a lesser version, and the replacement feels like a loss. The emotional response is frustration, sometimes anger, sometimes the particular sadness that comes from watching something you cared about decline. When a character is reverse Flanderized, simplicity to complexity, the audience feels the opposite. They feel that something has been given to them. The character they thought they knew, the character they had categorized and filed away, turns out to be deeper than they assumed, and the depth feels like a gift. The emotional response is surprise, then delight, then a retroactive re-evaluation of every previous appearance that transforms the simple character into a hidden one. You go back and watch the early Pops episodes, and they look different now. His innocence looks different. His good show looks different. The butterfly watching, the piano playing, the gentle laughter that used to seem like the whole of his character now seems like the surface of something vast. The show takes a character who spent 6 seasons as the simplest person in the room and reveals that the simplicity contained multitudes. The naivety was not a lack of understanding. It was a surplus of goodness so total that it looked like innocence from the outside. The early Pops and the late Pops are the same person. The audience's perception of that person is what changed, and the change retroactively enriches every moment the character appeared in across the entire run. Pop's reverse Flanderization is proof that the phenomenon can work in both directions, and that a character reduced to a single trait can be rebuilt if the writers are willing to treat the trait as a starting point rather than a destination. The innocence that defined early Pops is not abandoned in the cosmic reveal. It is explained. It is given a context and a weight that it did not previously possess, and the result is one of the most emotionally devastating character arcs in animated television. An arc that only works because the character spent 6 seasons seeming like he would never have one. Skips is the character whose Flanderization is the most subtle, the most easily overlooked, and in some ways the most telling about the limits of what a show can do with a character archetype. Skips is an immortal Yeti. He has been alive for centuries. He works at the park because he made a promise to the Guardians of Eternal Youth. A promise that is explored in detail in the Season 2 episode Fists of Justice, which aired on June 6, 2011. He is the show's problem solver. When something supernatural threatens the park, which happens approximately once per episode, Skips is the character who knows what to do. He has seen it before. He has fought it before. He has a book, or a contact, or a personal history with whatever ancient entity has emerged this week to threaten reality. The problem with Skips is not that the show exaggerates one of his traits at the expense of others. His Flanderization does not follow the standard pattern because there is no single trait that swells at the expense of the others. Instead, what happens to Skips is something more structural and in some ways more insidious. The show discovers that Skips is useful, and the usefulness consumes everything else about him. It is that the show relies on one of his traits so heavily that the character becomes a narrative function rather than a person. Skips is the answer. That is his role. He is the Deus Ex Machina in a Yeti costume. When the plot gets stuck, Skips unsticks it. When the characters need information, Skips provides it. When the danger escalates beyond what Mordecai and Rigby can handle, Skips arrives and handles it. The reliability is his most prominent characteristic. And the reliability is Flanderized not through exaggeration, but through repetition. By the time Season 4 arrives, premiering on October 1st, 2012, with the half-hour episode Exit 9B, the pattern has become visible enough to feel mechanical. You can time it. Something goes wrong in the first 2 minutes. The characters spend the next 5 minutes trying to solve it themselves and failing. Someone, usually Mordecai or Rigby, says a variation of "we should ask Skips." And the episode pivots to Skips providing the answer, the context, the piece of ancient knowledge that unlocks the resolution. The pattern is visible enough to feel mechanical. Something goes wrong. The characters panic. Someone says we should ask Skips. Skips appears. Skips solves the problem or provides the crucial piece of information that allows others to solve it. The plot resolves. Skips returns to his garage to lift weights alone. The cycle repeats. And within that cycle, the other dimensions of Skip's character, his loneliness, his grief over the woman he loved and lost, his complicated relationship with his own immortality, his status as the only character in the park who will outlive everyone he cares about, are deployed only when the show writes a Skip-centric episode and are otherwise dormant. The Skip story arc, which spans several episodes, including the Season 5 episode Skip Story aired on February 4th, 2014, is the show's most ambitious attempt to give Skips the depth that his functional role in the cast denies him. The episode explores his origin, his love for a woman named Mona, who died because of his failure to protect her, a failure that led directly to his deal with the Guardians of Eternal Youth and the immortality that followed. The episode is structured as a flashback, and the structure is important because it is the only extended look at who Skips was before he became the person the show uses as a narrative Swiss Army knife. Young Skips is not reliable. Young Skips is not the answer to every question. Young Skips is a person in love, which is to say a person who is vulnerable, uncertain, capable of failure, and terrified of loss. He is everything that present-day Skips is not, and the distance between the two versions is the distance that grief has carried him. Mona's death is the event that creates the Skips the show uses for 8 seasons. Her death is the reason he became immortal. Her death is the reason he dedicated himself to knowledge and competence, and the methodical cataloging of every supernatural threat the world might produce. The reliability is not a personality trait. It is a grief response. Skips became the answer because being the answer meant never having to sit with the question of what he lost and why he could not prevent the losing. It is genuinely moving. It reveals a character who carries a grief so old and so permanent that he has built an entire personality around containing it. The reliability, the competence, the stoic calm, all of it is revealed as a coping mechanism, a way of staying useful in a world that keeps changing around him while he stays the same. But the episode also exposes the problem. The depth exists. It is well written. It is emotionally effective. And then the next episode airs, and Skips is back to being the answer. The depth is contained in its designated episodes and does not leak into the episodes where Skips is primarily a narrative tool. The character oscillates between two versions of himself, the deep Skips of his spotlight episodes and the functional Skips of everyone else's episode, and the show never fully reconciles the two. This is Flanderisation by compartmentalization. It is the most sophisticated form of the phenomenon because it disguises itself as depth. The character has multiple traits, and the show can point to the existence of those traits as evidence that Flanderisation has not occurred, but the traits are deployed in different episodes, rather than coexisting within the same scene. Deep Skips appears in November. Functional Skips appears in January. They never overlap. They never inform each other. The grief that defines Deep Skips does not influence the problem solving that defines functional Skips, and the competence of functional Skips does not offer any comfort to the grief of Deep Skips. The two versions are maintained in separate containers, and the separation means that neither version achieves the fullness that a unified character would possess. Deep Skips and functional Skips never meet. The man who lost Mona and the Yeti, who knows how to defeat this week's supernatural threat, are technically the same person, but the show treats them as different characters who happen to share a body. The result is a character who is more interesting in theory than in practice, whose potential exceeds his execution, and whose Flanderisation is invisible because it hides behind the appearance of occasional depth. The love triangle between Mordecai, Margaret, and CJ deserves its own examination, not because it Flanderizes Mordecai, which has already been discussed, but because it Flanderizes two additional characters whose potential the show spent years building and then abandoned in the service of a plot that served none of them well. Margaret Smith is introduced in the first episode of regular show as the Red Robin, who works at the coffee shop. Her presence is immediate and uncomplicated. She is Mordecai's crush. She is pretty. She is nice. She works nearby, and Mordecai cannot talk to her without becoming a stuttering disaster. In the early seasons, this is fine. Margaret exists as a motivation for Mordecai, rather than as a character in her own right, and the show makes no pretense otherwise. She is a goal, not a person. The show begins to change this in seasons 2 and 3. Margaret gets episodes that explore her perspective. She is not just seen through Mordecai's love-struck gaze anymore. She is seen on her own terms, in her own spaces, with her own problems that have nothing to do with the Blue Jay, who cannot order a coffee without stammering. The show invests real narrative time in establishing Margaret as a person independent of the romance. She has ambitions that extend beyond the coffee shop and beyond the park. She has ambition. She wants to be a journalist. She has a complicated dating history that the show plays for comedy, but that also suggests a person who has been through things and carries the knowledge of having been through them. She is not just the pretty girl at the coffee shop. She is a young woman with plans that do not involve being the object of a Blue Jay's romantic paralysis. The show invests in this development. It builds Margaret into someone worth caring about independently of her relationship to Mordecai. And then the Flanderisation begins, not of Margaret specifically, but of the show's treatment of Margaret. As the love triangle develops across seasons 4 through 6, Margaret is gradually reduced from a developing character to a plot device. She appears when the story needs her to appear. She generates tension between Mordecai and CJ by existing in proximity to Mordecai. Her journalism career, which was one of the most promising threads the show had introduced, is mentioned occasionally and explored rarely. The Margaret of the love triangle is not the Margaret of the earlier character building episodes. She is a symbol, a trigger for Mordecai's anxiety, a walking complication whose presence in a scene reliably produces the same emotional response every time. The scene in Merry Christmas, Mordecai, which aired on December 4th, 2014, where Margaret and Mordecai kiss under mistletoe while Mordecai is dating CJ, crystallizes the problem. The kiss is not about Margaret. It is not about what Margaret wants or feels or has decided. It is about what the kiss does to the plot. Margaret is present as a catalyst, not as a participant. She acts, but the action has no interiority. The show does not ask why Margaret would kiss someone she knows is in a relationship. It does not explore her emotional state or her motivation. She kisses Mordecai because the plot needs the complication, and Margaret has been reduced to the role of complication generator. CJ, or Cloudy J, suffers even more visibly. Introduced in season 4 as Mordecai's new love interest after Margaret's departure, CJ arrives in the show as one of the most fully realized characters regular show had ever created. She is funny. She is athletic. She shares Mordecai's taste in music and movies. She is emotionally direct in a way that Margaret never was. And she has a temper that the show initially treats as an interesting character trait rather than a problem. CJ gets angry when she feels disrespected. She gets angry when people are dishonest with her. Her anger is a reasonable response to unreasonable situation, and the show, in the early CJ episodes, treats it as such. The Flanderisation of CJ is rapid and devastating. It happens across approximately 15 episodes in seasons 5 and 6, and the speed of the transformation is part of what makes it so jarring. A character who was introduced with nuance and specificity is compressed into a single trait in the span of a single season. As the love triangle intensifies, CJ's anger, which was introduced as a legitimate emotional response to legitimate provocations, is exaggerated into a defining flaw. The exaggeration follows a specific pattern. In the early CJ episodes, her anger is triggered by genuine mistreatment. Mordecai lies to her. Mordecai is evasive about his feeling. Mordecai puts her in situations where any reasonable person would be upset. Her anger makes sense. By the later episodes, her anger is triggered by proximity. Margaret exists in the same space as Mordecai, and CJ becomes volatile. The trigger has shifted from mistreatment to presence, and the shift transforms CJ from a person with justified emotions into a person with uncontrollable ones. Her temper becomes the thing. She is no longer the cool, confident woman who happens to have boundaries that she enforces vigorously. She is the angry girlfriend, the volatile one. The one whose presence in a scene raises the threat level because you never know when something will set her off. The exaggeration is not subtle. CJ's anger becomes cartoonishly destructive, manifesting as literal storm clouds and weather phenomena that threaten the physical safety of everyone around her. And the literalization of her anger is itself a form of Flanderisation, because it transforms an internal emotional state into an external spectacle. Anger, when it lives inside a person, is complex. It has causes and contexts and degrees. Anger, when it manifests as a thunderstorm that destroys property and endangers lives, is simple. It is a special effect. It is a visual gag book, dressed up as character development. The show takes CJ's most human trait, her willingness to feel strongly about things that matter to her, and turns it into a superpower. And the transformation strips the trait of everything that made it human. And the shift from character trait to character caricature happens so quickly that you can almost pinpoint the episode where the writing changed. The worst part of CJ's Flanderisation is that it makes Mordecai's indecision seem less like a character flaw and more like a rational response. If CJ is volatile and unpredictable, then Mordecai's reluctance to commit to her becomes understandable rather than pathetic. The show, whether intentionally or not, Flanderizes CJ to retroactively justify Mordecai's behavior, and the justification comes at the cost of a character who deserved better writing than she received. CJ is not Margaret. CJ was built from the beginning as a three-dimensional person. She had interests and fears and a history and a sense of humor. The show knew how to write her. It chose, in the love triangle episodes, not to. The collective Flanderization of the love triangle, the simultaneous reduction of three characters to their worst traits in the service of a plot that satisfies none of them, is regular show's most significant writing failure. And it is significant not because the writing is bad on a sentence-by-sentence level. The individual episodes are often well-crafted. The dialogue is sharp. The comedic timing is intact. The animation remains beautiful. The failure is architectural. It is a failure of design, of deciding that the show's central narrative engine should be powered by romantic indecision, rather than by the supernatural absurdity and workplace comedy and gentle philosophical questioning that made the first two seasons special. The love triangle is a wrong turn taken confidently, maintained stubbornly, and corrected eventually, but not before it had reshaped the audience's relationship with three characters who deserved a better story than the one they were given. It is not the most visible failure, because Rigby's mid-series jerkishness is louder and more immediately grating, but it is the deepest failure, because it squanders the most potential. Mordecai, Margaret, and CJ are all interesting characters whose interesting qualities are submerged beneath a narrative that requires them to be simple, predictable, and repetitive. The love triangle is Flanderization as a system rather than an individual event. It is not one character being reduced. It is three characters being reduced simultaneously, each reduction enabling and accelerating the other. Mordecai's indecision makes CJ angrier, which makes Margaret more passive, which makes Mordecai more indecisive. The system feeds itself. It is a structure that reduces everyone who enters it. And the reduction is self-sustaining, because each character's Flanderized trait triggers the Flanderized traits of the other. Thomas deserves a mention, not because his Flanderization is severe, but because his case illustrates a specific variant of the phenomenon that happens to characters who join established casts late. Thomas is introduced in Season 4 as an intern at the park. He arrives in the episode Exit 9B, the season premiere, and his initial characterization is minimal. He is the new guy. He is nervous. He is overwhelmed by the park's routine supernatural catastrophes in the way that a reasonable person would be overwhelmed by the park's routine supernatural catastrophes, which is to say completely. He reacts to the chaos with the wide-eyed bewilderment that the established characters lost seasons ago. And the bewilderment is his function. He is the surrogate for new viewers, the character who does not understand what is happening, because the audience might not understand what is happening. His initial characterization is minimal. He is the new guy. He is nervous. He is easily overwhelmed. These are reasonable traits for an intern, and the show uses them to generate comedy from the clash between Thomas's normalcy and the park's supernatural chaos. Thomas's Flanderization, such as it is, consists of the show never developing him beyond the new guy. He remains the outsider. He remains the one who does not understand what is happening. He remains the straight man in a cast that already has multiple straight men, and his presence in episodes often feels redundant because the function he serves, the reasonable person in an unreasonable situation, is already filled by Mordecai, by Benson, and occasionally by Eileen. The show attempts to solve this problem in season 6 with the revelation that Thomas is actually a Russian spy named Nikolai, a twist that is either the most creative deflanderization in the show's history or the most desperate, depending on your tolerance for plot twists that rewrite everything you knew about a character in a single episode. The spy reveal, which occurs in the season 6 episode The Real Thomas, aired on November 13th, 2014, gives Thomas an instant backstory, an instant motivation, and an instant exit from the show. The reveal is handled with the kind of escalating absurdity that regular show does best. The quiet, nervous intern is actually a Russian intelligence operative named Nikolai, who has been gathering information on the park for reasons connected to its supernatural significance. The twist is entertaining. It is well executed. The episode is one of the more memorable entries in season 6, and it gives Thomas more character in 22 minutes than he received in 2 previous seasons combined. But the entertainment value does not disguise what the twist actually is. It is a shortcut. It is the writers admitting, through the mechanism of the story itself, that they could not figure out how to develop Thomas organically, and so chose instead to replace him with a more interesting character wearing the same face. It is Flanderisation reversed through explosion, rather than through development. The character is not gradually invested with depth. He is detonated out of his flatness, and while the twist is fun, it is also an admission of failure. The show could not figure out what to do with Thomas as a person, so it turned him into a premise. Eileen Roberts is the exception. She is the character who, across 8 seasons and 261 episodes, resists Flanderisation more completely than anyone else in the cast. This is worth examining, because the resistance is not accidental. It reveals something about the conditions that produce Flanderisation and the conditions that prevent it. Eileen is introduced as Margaret's co-worker at the coffee shop. She is small. She is quiet. She wears glasses. She has a crush on Rigby that is obvious to everyone except Rigby. In the early seasons, these traits constitute her entire characterization, and the show could easily have left her there. The quiet girl with the crush, the female equivalent of early Mordecai's romantic anxiety. The template was available. The show chose not to use it. What the show does with Eileen, slowly and without the dramatic reversals that characterize the other character's arc, is allow her to grow. She does not grow through crisis. She does not grow through revelation. She grows through the accumulation of small, consistent details that, over time, add up to a fully realized person. Eileen is smart, not cartoon smart, where the character solves a problem once to demonstrate the trait and then returns to default. Consistently smart, in a way that informs how she approaches every situation. She is observant in the way that quiet people are often observant, in the way that comes from spending years listening instead of talking, from developing the skill of reading rooms, because you are never the person dominating them. She notices things that the louder characters miss, patterns in behavior, inconsistencies in story, emotional undercurrents that the people experiencing them cannot identify. She is patient, but her patience is not passivity. It is the patience of someone who understands that some things take time, and is willing to provide the time without demanding credit for providing it. Eileen's relationship with Rigby is the show's most successful romantic arc, and it succeeds precisely because neither character is Flanderized within the relationship. Compare it to every other romantic arc in the show. Mordecai and Margaret's arc Flanderizes Mordecai into a nervous wreck. Mordecai and CJ's arc Flanderizes CJ into an angry storm cloud. Muscle Man and Starla's arc, while warmer and more affectionate, occasionally reduces both characters to their loudest traits for comedic effect. Eileen and Rigby's arc does none of these things. The characters within the relationship remain the characters they are outside of it. Eileen does not become softer or more accommodating because she is dating Rigby. Rigby does not become more responsible because he is dating Eileen. Both characters change, but the changes are internal and gradual and driven by genuine development rather than romantic pressure. The show does not reduce Eileen to the supportive girlfriend or Rigby to the immature boyfriend. Both characters retain their full range of traits within the partnership. Eileen challenges Rigby. She supports him when support is warranted and pushes back when support would enable regression. She has opinions that are separate from his. She has goals that are separate from his. She remains her own person while also being part of a couple. And the show treats this balance as something that requires ongoing negotiation, rather than a state that, once achieved, is permanent. The reason Eileen avoids Flanderization is structural, and understanding the structure illuminates why Flanderization happens to some characters and not others in ways that have nothing to do with the quality of the writing or the skill of the writers. Eileen avoids Flanderization because the show never needs her to be a problem. She is never the primary driver of conflict. She does not cause episodes to happen. She exists within episodes that other characters have caused, and her role is to navigate the chaos with intelligence and patience, rather than to generate it. This means that the writers never develop a template for Eileen. There is no Eileen episode formula, the way there is a Mordecai romantic anxiety formula, or a Rigby selfishness formula, or a Benson anger formula. Without a template, there is nothing to repeat. Without repetition, there is no amplification. Without amplification, there is no Flanderization. Eileen's immunity to Flanderization is a consequence of her narrative modesty, her willingness to be the supporting character in other people's stories, rather than the protagonist of her own. Her traits are never the source of an episode's central tension. She does not generate chaos or produce the kind of exaggerated emotional responses that fuel comedy. The traits that define Eileen, intelligence, patience, perceptiveness, are traits that support other people's stories rather than dominating them. And because the show never needs to rely on a single Eileen trait to generate a plot, no single trait is amplified to the point of distortion. She avoids Flanderization by being useful without being exploitable. This brings us to the larger pattern, the structural observation that binds all of these individual case studies into a single argument. The Flanderization of regular shows cast is not random. It follows rules, and the rules, once you see them, explain not just why specific characters were Flanderized, but why Flanderization happens to long-running shows in general. The first rule is that Flanderization targets traits that generate conflict. Mordecai's romantic anxiety generates conflict. Rigby's selfishness generates conflict. Benson's anger generates conflict. Muscleman's abrasiveness generates conflict. These traits are the ones the writers reach for when they need a story engine. And the more they reach for them, the larger the traits become. And the larger the traits become, the more efficiently they generate conflict. And the cycle feeds itself until the trait has consumed the character. The second rule is that Flanderization accelerates in the middle season. This is true across almost every long-running animated comedy. And the reason is structural rather than creative. The first season of a show is a honeymoon. The writers are excited. The characters are new. Every story is being told for the first time. And the freshness covers a multitude of sins. The last season is a farewell tour. The writers know the end is coming, and the knowledge focuses the work. They write with intention. They tie up threads. They give the characters endings that honor their beginning. It is the middle that kills. The middle is where the show has to sustain itself without the energy of a beginning or the purpose of an ending. And the middle is where writers, who are human and tired and working under deadlines that do not care about artistic integrity, reach for the shortcuts that Flanderization provides. The first season of a show is about establishing characters. The last season is about resolving them. The middle seasons are about sustaining them. And sustaining is the hardest part of the job, because it requires the writers to find new things to say about people they have already introduced. The temptation, always, is to say the same thing louder, to take the trait that worked in season 1 and amplify it in season 3, and amplify it further in season 5. Flanderization is the sound of writers running out of new ideas and turning up the volume on old ones. The third rule is that Flanderization is reversible, but the reversal requires more work than the original development. This is perhaps the most important rule, because it is the one that determines whether a Flanderized show can recover. And the mathematics are brutal. Consider Rigby. The show spent 1 season establishing him as a complex character. It spent 3 seasons reducing him to a selfish caricature. And it spent 2 seasons rebuilding him. The ratio is roughly 1 to 3 to 2. 1 part construction, 3 parts destruction, 2 parts reconstruction. The reconstruction takes twice as long as the original construction because it must overcome not just the character's current state, but the audience's accumulated memory of the Flanderized version. You are not just building a character. You are building a character while the audience remembers and resents the version of the character you are building over. This ratio is consistent across the cast. Mordecai's complexity took 2 seasons to establish and 3 to destroy. Benson's humanity took 2 seasons to establish and 4 to erode. The destruction is always faster because destruction requires only repetition. Show the same trait enough times and it will overwrite everything else. Construction requires invention. Every episode that adds depth to a character must introduce something new, something the audience has not seen before, something that surprises without contradicting. Construction is creative work. Destruction is mechanical work. And mechanical work, by its nature, is faster. It took regular show 1 season to establish Rigby as a layered character, 3 seasons to flatten him into a selfish caricature, and 2 seasons to rebuild him. The mathematics of Flanderisation are unforgiving. Destruction is faster than construction. A character's complexity can be undone in a handful of episodes, but restoring that complexity takes significantly longer, because the audience's memory of the Flanderized version must be overwritten with new experiences that are consistent, convincing, and sustained long enough to become the dominant impression. The 4th rule is that some characters resist Flanderization because their traits are not useful as story engine. This is the cruelest rule because it means that the characters most likely to be Flanderized are the characters with the most dramatically interesting traits. Anger is dramatically interesting. Selfishness is dramatically interesting. Romantic anxiety is dramatically interesting. These traits start fights, create tension, generate the energy that comedy requires. Intelligent, patient, loyalty. These traits end fights, resolve tension, and dissipate energy. They are dramatically useful, but narratively unexcitable. You cannot build an 11-minute episode around someone being patient. Patience, by definition, resists the compression that episodic television requires. This means that the characters who survive Flanderization intact are often the least exciting characters in the cast, and the characters who are Flanderized most severely are often the most exciting. It is a selection effect. The traits that make a character compelling are the same traits that make a character vulnerable to exaggeration, and the vulnerability is proportional to the compellingness. Eileen is smart and patient. Smartness and patience do not start fight. They do not cause problem. They do not generate the kind of conflict that drives an 11-minute animated comedy episode. And so, Eileen's traits are never amplified, because amplifying them would not produce story. The characters who escape Flanderization are the characters whose best qualities are the least narratively exploitable. What makes regular show's relationship with Flanderization special? What separates it from the dozens of animated comedies that Flanderize their casts and never look back is the show's willingness to confront what it has done. This willingness is not present from the beginning. The show does not Flanderize its characters knowingly, with a plan to de-Flanderize them later. That would require a level of narrative foresight that almost no television show possesses, certainly not one producing 11-minute episodes on a weekly production schedule for a children's network. The Flanderization happens for the usual reason: tight deadlines, familiar templates, the gravitational pull of what worked before. The show falls into the same traps that every long-running show falls into, and it falls for the same reason. What makes regular show different is what happens after the fall. Most shows that Flanderize their characters do not notice, or if they notice, do not care, or if they care, do not have the institutional support to attempt a correction. Corrections are expensive. They require episodes that prioritize character over comedy. They require writers to resist the proven formulas that got them through the lean weeks. They require network executives to trust that an audience trained on one version of a character will accept a different version. Regular show somehow cleared all of these hurdles. The show's willingness to confront what it has done is not just a creative achievement. It is an institutional one. Most long-running comedies do not course correct. The Simpsons Flanderized Homer into a brain-damaged buffoon and kept him there for 20 seasons. Family Guy Flanderized Peter Griffin into a sociopath and doubled down. SpongeBob Flanderized its title character into a man-child and built an entire era of the show around the caricature. These shows are not worse than regular show. Some of them are considerably more successful, but they made a choice that regular show refused to make. They accepted the Flanderisation as permanent. Regular show did not accept it. Regular show looked at its characters in the middle season and recognized what the audience had been saying in comment sections and forum posts and review threads for years. The characters had become cartoon, not in the literal sense, because they were always cartoon, but in the pejorative sense, in the sense that the word cartoon is used to describe a person who has been simplified past the point of recognition. And the show made a choice. It chose repair over continuation. It chose the harder path. It looked at what it had done to Mordecai and said, we need to fix this. It looked at what it had done to Rigby and said, we need to rebuild this person from the foundation up. It looked at what it had done to Benson and said, the angry gumball machine deserves to be a man again. The willingness to repair is not universal. The show never fully repairs Margaret or CJ or High Five Ghost. The corrections are selective, applied to the characters the writers cared about most, or the characters whose Flanderisation was most visible. But the fact that corrections were attempted at all, the fact that the final 2 seasons of the show are functionally a rehabilitation program for its own cast, is remarkable. The final season, Season 8, which premiered on September 26th, 2016, with the episode One Space Day at a Time, takes the entire park into space. Literally, the dome lifts off the ground and launches into orbit, and the entire cast is carried along with it into a cosmic adventure that spans the full season. And the relocation is not just a narrative gimmick. It is a Flanderisation intervention. It is the show recognizing that its characters have been defined by their environment for too long, and that the only way to free them from their defining traits is to remove the environment that triggers those traits. By removing the characters from the setting where their Flanderized traits developed, the show gives them permission to be different. Mordecai does not have a love interest to be anxious about. Rigby does not have a job to be lazy at. Benson does not have employees to scream at. Muscle Man does not have an audience for his jokes. The traits that define the characters through the middle seasons become irrelevant in a new context. And what remains, the parts of each person that exist beneath the Flanderization, is allowed to surface. The space season is not perfect. The writing is occasionally uneven, and the cosmic mythology that drives the plot is sometimes more ambitious than the episode count can support. But the characters in Season 8 feel like people in a way that the characters in Seasons 4 and 5 did not. They feel specific. They feel individual. They feel like people who might do something you did not expect, which is the single most important quality a character can possess, and the first quality that Flanderization destroys. The capacity to surprise is the capacity to be real, because real people surprise you constantly, and characters who cannot surprise you are characters who have been reduced to mechanisms, and mechanisms are predictable by definition. The space season restores unpredictability to the regular show cast, and the restoration feels like breathing after being underwater. You did not realize how constrained the characters had become until the constraints were removed, and the characters began to move freely again. They feel capable of surprising you. They feel, for the first time in years, like they have not already been written. And this is the thing about Flanderization that regular show understands better than almost any show that has ever grappled with it. Flanderization is not just a writing problem. It is a trust problem. When a show Flanderizes its characters, it breaks the audience's trust that the characters are real, that they are capable of growth, that they exist as people rather than as mechanism. And when a show de-Flanderizes its characters, it is not just fixing the writing, it is rebuilding the trust. It is saying to the audience, we know what we did, and we know you noticed, and we are going to do the work of earning your belief in these people again. Regular show did that work. Not perfectly, not completely, but more honestly and more deliberately than most shows ever attempt. And the result is a body of work that is, paradoxically, more interesting because of its failures than it would have been without them. The Flanderized middle seasons are not the show's best work, but they are the reason the final seasons feel as meaningful as they do, because the recovery would not be remarkable if there had not first been a collapse worth recovering from. Which brings us back to where we started. The wedding. Muscle Man, and Starla, June 25th, 2015. The dome lights are warm. The guests are assembled. The couple at the altar, Muscle Man and Starla, two characters who the show could have left as punchlines, and chose instead to develop into the most stable partnership in the cast, has earned this moment through seasons of genuine emotional development, through Trucker Hall of Fame grief and my mom joke armor, and the slow, patient work of learning to be vulnerable with another person. The moment where Mordecai stood up and made someone else's celebration about his own romantic confusion. That scene, which felt at the time like the lowest point of Mordecai's Flanderisation, looks different in retrospect. It looks like a turning point. It looks like the moment where the show finally saw what it had done to its protagonist and decided consciously to stop. The next season begins with Mordecai sitting on a bench, quietly acknowledging that he has been handling things badly. The love triangle is resolved, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with an exhausted release. And Mordecai begins the slow, difficult, necessary work of becoming a person again. The wedding was not the end of Mordecai's Flanderisation. It was the end of the show's tolerance for it. And that distinction between a character's worst moment and a show's moment of recognition is the distinction that separates regular show from the shows that Flanderize their casts without consequence. The show saw the damage. The show cared about the damage. And the show, in its final act, chose to repair what it could. That is not a story about Flanderization. Not really. Not when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. That is a story about love. The kind of love that is rarely discussed in the context of animation or television writing, but that is present in every show that runs long enough to break its own characters and then puts in the work to repair them. It is the love that creators feel for the people they have invented. It is a specific kind of love, rarely discussed because it sounds absurd when you describe it out loud. These are fictional people. They do not exist. They are drawings and dialogue and the product of decisions made in writers' rooms under fluorescent light. And yet the people who make them care about them with an intensity that rivals how they care about real people in their lives. The writers of regular show spent years with these characters. They ate lunch while discussing what Mordecai would do. They stayed late arguing about whether Rigby had earned a particular moment. They invested their creative lives in the welfare of imaginary people. And that investment is a form of love, the stubborn, irrational attachment to fictional beings that persists even when the pressures of production have distorted those beings into something unrecognizable. The writers of regular show did not set out to Flanderize their cast. Nobody does. Flanderization is not a plan. It is an accumulation of small compromises, each one individually defensible, each one pushing the character slightly further from the original design, until the distance is large enough to be visible. And the visibility is the thing that triggers the correction. The correction is the love. The correction is the part that matters. Any show can Flanderize its character. It happens automatically. The way entropy increases in a closed system, the way a river finds the path of least resistance and carves it deeper with every passing season. What does not happen automatically is the decision to fight the current. The decision to look at a character who has been reduced to a punchline and say, this person deserves to be a person again. That decision requires the writers to care about something beyond the immediate demands of this week's episode. It requires them to care about the character's wholeness, the character's arc, the character's right to grow and change and surprise the audience in ways that Flanderization makes impossible. The kind of love that writers have for the characters they create. The kind of love that survives the mistakes they make in the middle. The kind of love that shows up at the end, after the damage has been done, and does the unglamorous, invisible work of making things right. Regular show loved its characters enough to ruin them, and then loved them enough to fix them. The ruin was not the plan. The fix was not guaranteed. Both happened because the show ran long enough, and the people making it cared deeply enough, and the characters themselves were sturdy enough to survive the process. Not all of them survived equally. Margaret and CJ bear scars that the show never fully healed. High Five Ghost never received the depth he deserved. Skips remains partitioned between his functional self and his emotional self. But Mordecai is an artist. Rigby is a father. Benson found love. Muscle Man took off the armor. Pops saved the universe with a hug. And if the cost of those endings was a difficult middle, A stretch of seasons where the characters were less than they could have been, then the cost was worth paying. That is more than most shows manage. That is enough. If you found something worth carrying away from this, subscribing helps more than you would think. Thank you for staying. I will see you in the next one.